The arrest. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, its warmth belied by the tension crackling in the air. Officer Tom Grady stood near the patrol car, scanning the park with a practiced eye. It was a quiet day, too quiet for his liking. Grady liked to keep busy. It made him feel in control, like he was doing his part to maintain law and order. He had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, and although most days were uneventful, today something was different. He didn't know what, but his gut told him to be alert. As he made his usual rounds, he noticed a woman sitting alone on a bench, reading a book. There was something about her that made him pause. She was black, well-dressed, and had an air of composure about her that both intrigued and unnerved him. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and dog walkers passing by. His instincts kicked in. Something about her didn't feel right to him. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't seem to belong in this part of town, or maybe it was because she was too calm, too poised, in a place where people usually kept their heads down. Tom hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. He approached her with measured steps, trying to appear casual. The woman didn't look up from her book as he neared. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" The woman slowly raised her eyes from the page and looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem surprised, and that unsettled him. She closed the book with deliberate calmness and placed it on her lap, folding her hands on top of it. "I'm enjoying my afternoon," she replied simply. Her voice was smooth, calm, and completely devoid of fear or deference. It was the kind of response that put Tom on edge, even though there was nothing inherently wrong with what she said. He stood over her, towering slightly, trying to assert his authority. "This park is usually empty around this time. Are you sure you're not waiting for someone?" "No, officer," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "Just taking in the peace and quiet." Tom shifted uncomfortably. Something about this woman was getting under his skin. She was too composed, too self-assured. Most people reacted with at least some nervousness when a cop approached them, but she didn't flinch. "Can I see some ID?" he asked, the suspicion creeping into his voice. The woman's gaze didn't falter. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her tone still calm, but with an edge now, a slight challenge behind her words. Tom's hand unconsciously moved to his belt, where his handcuffs rested. "Just routine, ma'am," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't look like you're from around here." The woman sighed softly, as if she had seen this scene play out 100 times before. She reached into her bag and pulled out a wallet, carefully handing over her ID. Tom took it and glanced at the name. Special Agent Maya Williams, Federal Bureau of Investigation. His heart skipped a beat. For a split second, Tom's mind went blank. FBI. This woman was an FBI agent. That couldn't be right. There was no way someone like her, someone who looked like her, could hold that kind of position. He tried to shake off the doubt, but it clung to him like a stubborn shadow. His grip on the ID tightened as he stared at it, his mind racing. He had a choice now. He could let this go, apologize for bothering her, and move on. But something in him wouldn't let that happen. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fact that people were starting to glance in their direction. If he backed down now, it would look weak. And Tom Grady didn't do weak. "You'll need to come with me, ma'am," he said, his voice harder now, more authoritative. "We'll need to verify this ID at the station." Maya didn't move for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. Tom couldn't tell what she was thinking, but he sensed that she wasn't going to come quietly. His hand went to the cuffs again, and this time he pulled them out. "Stand up," he ordered. Maya rose to her feet slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She wasn't giving him any excuse to escalate the situation, but she also wasn't cowering. A small crowd had started to gather nearby. Sensing that something wasn't right, Tom reached for her wrists, his hands trembling slightly as he roughly pulled them behind her back. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into her skin, but she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The weight of history pressed down on her in that moment. Of all the black men and women who had stood in her shoes, unjustly accused, and treated like criminals simply for existing, she wasn't just an FBI agent right now. She was every person of color who had been humiliated, mistreated, or denied their dignity. "Let's go," Tom muttered, steering her toward the patrol car. The onlookers watched, some pulling out their phones to record the scene as it unfolded. Maya could hear their murmurs of disbelief, but she kept her composure. This wasn't over. As they reached the car, Tom opened the door and guided her inside. His grip was firm, but there was a hesitation in his movements now, a flicker of doubt. Something wasn't sitting right with him. He slammed the door shut and took a deep breath, trying to shake the growing sense of unease gnawing at his insides. Inside the car, Maya sat still, her hands cuffed behind her back. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm. She had done nothing wrong, and soon enough, the truth would come to light. Tom Grady had no idea who he had just arrested, but he was about to find out. Tom climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced as he replayed the last few minutes. For the first time, a small pit of dread began to form in his stomach. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Maya's for a brief second. There was something unsettling in her gaze, something knowing, something he hadn't anticipated. "What were you doing in that park?" he asked, trying to reassert control over the situation. Maya's voice was steady when she answered, "I told you. I was enjoying my day." Tom clenched his jaw. "A woman like you, just sitting around reading, doesn't add up." Maya raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. "A woman like me." He didn't answer, and instead turned his focus back to the road. He knew what he was implying, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not to her, and certainly not to himself. His grip on the wheel tightened as they drove through the city streets, but for Tom, the ride felt much longer than usual. In the back seat, Maya kept her gaze out the window, her thoughts drifting to the many black women who had been in her shoes before her. How many times had this same scene played out across the country? How many women had walked away unharmed? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. This time, it wouldn't end the same way. Unraveling consequences. As the patrol car rolled through the streets, tension sat like an unwelcome passenger between them. The weight of the situation was beginning to press harder on Officer Tom Grady. His eyes flickered between the road and the rearview mirror, catching brief glimpses of Maya's calm face. She didn't fidget or speak, and that silence only amplified his discomfort. He wasn't accustomed to second-guessing himself. After all, he'd made plenty of arrests in his career. Some were routine, others more difficult, but none of them ever left him feeling like this. Something about this situation felt wrong, but pride kept him on his course. He couldn't back down now, not in front of the bystanders who had been watching, and certainly not in front of this woman who seemed to embody everything that rattled him. As the precinct loomed in the distance, Tom's chest tightened. The precinct was his home turf, a place where he was in control. But now, for the first time in years, he didn't feel sure of himself. The gravity of who Maya Williams was, an FBI agent, nagged at him. Even worse was the question of what would happen when the truth came out. His fingers tapped nervously against the steering wheel as they approached the station. Behind him, Maya's calm exterior remained unshaken, though her mind was anything but still. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. She could feel the weight of every black woman who had ever been unjustly arrested bearing down on her, and that knowledge carried a profound responsibility. In her mind, this wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. And while she had the power to defend herself in this situation, she thought of those who didn't. They pulled into the precinct parking lot, and Tom parked the car abruptly, his mind spinning with a mixture of dread and stubbornness. He stepped out and walked around to open the door for Maya, more harshly than he intended. His grip on her arm as he led her inside the station was firmer than necessary, betraying his growing anxiety. As they walked through the station's entrance, the usual noise of ringing phones and chattering officers slowed to a hum. Heads turned. There was something about seeing a well-dressed black woman in handcuffs, walking confidently alongside an officer, that made everyone pause. Even though no one spoke, Tom could feel the shift in the air. Some officers raised their eyebrows in surprise. Others muttered to their partners. They all knew something was different about this one. Officer Jenkins, who was sitting at a nearby desk, stood up quickly. He shot Tom a look as if to ask, "What the hell is going on?" But Tom avoided his gaze. Jenkins had been on the force for longer than Tom, and though they had worked together for years, Tom suddenly felt uneasy under his friend's scrutinizing stare. "Tom, what's going on?" Jenkins asked, his voice low but firm as he walked over to where they stood. He glanced at Maya, who stood silently, still with an air of quiet authority that made everyone around her feel uncertain. "Just routine," Tom muttered, guiding Maya toward the processing desk. Jenkins followed closely, his suspicion growing. Routine. He didn't press further, but the unspoken question lingered heavily between them. Jenkins was too smart to accept that explanation at face value. He knew Tom well enough to sense that this was far from routine, and there was something in the way Tom was avoiding eye contact that made Jenkins uneasy. As Tom began the processing paperwork, he felt the pressure building. It wasn't just from the officers around him or the weight of Maya's calm gaze, it was from within. He had stepped into something bigger than he'd anticipated, and now it was all starting to unravel. He fumbled with the computer, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to focus on typing in the necessary details. Maya stood silently beside him, her eyes scanning the room. She could see the officers exchanging glances, some clearly confused, others intrigued. The silence in the room grew louder, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. She had been in plenty of intense situations before, but this felt different. Here, she was fighting an unseen battle, one where the stakes weren't just about her freedom, but about what her arrest symbolized. Tom continued his work, but he could feel the tension creeping up his spine. Every keystroke felt like a hammer driving nails into the fragile structure of his authority. Finally, as he reached for the fingerprinting kit, the door to the captain's office opened. Captain Martinez, a seasoned officer with decades of experience, stepped out, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the scene before him. "Grady, what's going on here?" Martinez's voice was calm but carried an undertone that demanded explanation. His gaze swept over Maya, lingering for just a moment before settling back on Tom. Tom straightened up, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Just processing a detainee, Captain. There was some suspicious behavior in the park." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't one to accept vague explanations, especially when they involved an arrest like this. Maya didn't fit the profile of a routine arrest, and Martinez could see that from a mile away. "What kind of suspicious behavior?" Martinez asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Tom hesitated, fumbling for the right words. She didn't have a good reason for being there. Captain Martinez's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed spoke volumes. Jenkins, who had been watching from a few steps back, shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in the room could feel the conversation teetering on the edge of something larger. Maya finally spoke, her voice steady but laced with quiet authority. "Captain, I'm Special Agent Maya Williams, FBI. I've already provided Officer Grady with my credentials. I'm sure he can confirm them." Her words cut through the tension like a blade. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Captain Martinez's eyes flickered with surprise, but only for a split second before he turned his gaze sharply to Tom. "Is that true?" Tom swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the ground beneath him slipping away. There was no backing out now. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Maya's ID, and handed it over to the captain. Martin studied it briefly, his jaw tightening as he processed what had just happened. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Jenkins stared at Tom in disbelief, the other officers now whispering among themselves. The weight of what had just unfolded began to settle over the entire precinct. This wasn't just a routine arrest. It was a mistake that could cost Tom his career. Captain Martinez turned back to Maya, his voice now filled with a quiet but unmistakable authority. "Agent Williams, I apologize for any inconvenience this has caused you. We'll resolve this matter immediately." Maya nodded, her expression composed, though her eyes betrayed the depth of her disappointment. She had expected this might happen, had seen it happen too many times before, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. There was a part of her that wanted to lash out, to let them feel the full force of her anger. But she knew that wouldn't serve her now. There was a bigger fight to be fought, and this was just the beginning. Tom stood frozen, his mind reeling as the reality of his actions hit him. This wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It was a colossal error in judgment. He had arrested a federal agent, a black woman in authority, and there was no undoing the damage that had been done. Captain Martinez gave Tom a hard look, one that made it clear that this conversation wasn't over. But for now, the captain turned his attention back to Maya. "We'll have you released immediately, Agent Williams. If there's anything else we can do, please don't hesitate to let me know." Maya glanced briefly at Tom before replying, "I'm sure this will be handled appropriately, Captain. Thank you." As the captain led her away, Tom stood alone in the middle of the room, the eyes of his fellow officers boring into him. The weight of his mistake settled heavily on his shoulders, but it wasn't just the arrest that haunted him. It was the realization of what lay beneath it, the ugly truth he hadn't wanted to confront. The fallout. Officer Tom Grady stood in the center of the precinct, his hands clammy, his heart pounding as if it were trying to break free from his chest. The low hum of conversation from the surrounding officers didn't register. All he could hear was the deafening silence in his own mind. Special Agent Maya Williams, FBI. Her identity was now burned into his thoughts, and every move he'd made up until this point was crashing down around him. He couldn't believe how quickly things had spiraled out of control. Arresting an FBI agent, a black female FBI agent, no less, based on nothing more than a gut feeling that had been dangerously misguided. It wasn't just the mistake itself, it was what it symbolized. He'd always prided himself on being an officer who followed his instincts, who made decisions quickly and with conviction. But this was something else. This was a catastrophic error in judgment that was quickly transforming into a nightmare. The eyes of his fellow officers, which normally held camaraderie or the quiet respect of colleagues, now bore down on him with a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and thinly veiled judgment. They had all seen the scene unfold. They had all watched as a woman of authority was wrongfully detained, and they all knew what was coming next. Captain Martinez had taken Agent Williams into his office for a private discussion. Jenkins had retreated to his desk, shaking his head slightly, as if he could hardly believe what Tom had done. The station seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation that was looming over Tom like a storm cloud. Minutes passed, agonizing, slow minutes, before the door to the captain's office swung open. Maya stepped out first, her head held high, her expression calm but distant. She didn't look at Tom, and for that he was somewhat grateful. He wasn't sure he could handle seeing the condemnation in her eyes. Captain Martinez followed close behind her, his face unreadable, but his body language stiff with authority. He escorted Maya out of the precinct, personally walking her to the door, a clear sign of respect that made the air in the room even heavier. Tom watched as the captain and Maya exchanged a few quiet words outside before she left, her form disappearing into the bustling city beyond the glass doors. Once she was gone, Martinez returned to the room, his eyes locking onto Tom immediately. There was no hesitation, no softness in his gaze. This wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. Martinez's face was carved with the hard lines of experience, and though he rarely raised his voice, when he was angry, his words had the sharpness of a blade. "Grady, my office. Now." The entire station seemed to exhale in unison, as if they had all been holding their breath, waiting for this moment. Tom followed his captain without a word, his stomach churning. Each step felt like a march toward the inevitable, the dismantling of everything he had worked for. Once inside the office, Martinez closed the door behind them and motioned for Tom to sit. The captain didn't take his seat behind the desk. Instead, he stood in front of it, arms crossed over his chest, eyes locked onto Tom with an intensity that made him feel like a rookie again. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Martinez's voice was low, but heavy with restrained anger. Tom swallowed hard. "Captain, I don't." Martinez cut him off, raising a hand. "I don't want excuses, Grady. I want an explanation. Why, in God's name, did you think it was a good idea to arrest an FBI agent? On what grounds?" Tom struggled to find the words, his mind racing, but everything he thought to say felt inadequate. He'd acted on a hunch, a gut feeling that had betrayed him. His instincts, the thing he'd always relied on, had failed him spectacularly. But that didn't seem like a good enough answer. I didn't know she was FBI at first," Tom began, his voice faltering. "She was just sitting there, and I thought." "Thought what?" Martinez barked. "That a black woman sitting in a park was suspicious. That she didn't belong there." Tom flinched at the bluntness of the question. It was the same thought that had crossed his mind earlier, but hearing it said out loud, in such stark terms, made it sound even worse. I wasn't thinking like that," Tom stammered. Something felt off. I thought I was following my instincts." Martinez's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching tightly. "Instincts? Is that what we're calling racial profiling now?" The words hit Tom like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. He wanted to explain, to justify, to defend himself, but every defense felt hollow, empty. He couldn't deny what had happened. He had seen a black woman sitting alone in a predominantly white neighborhood, and he had made assumptions, and those assumptions had led him to arrest someone who had done nothing wrong, someone who was, in fact, a federal agent. Martinez leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "This isn't just about you, Grady. Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've brought down on this precinct? We got an FBI agent wrongfully arrested. Probably half the people in that park filmed it. And the second this hits the media, it's going to blow up in our faces. The department will be under scrutiny. I'll be under scrutiny. And you." Martinez paused, his eyes narrowing. "You might have just cost yourself your career." Tom's chest tightened. The gravity of the situation weighed on him like never before. He had always known there were consequences to his actions, but he had never imagined they could be this severe. Losing his career, it felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. "Captain, I swear, I didn't mean for this to happen," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Martinez's gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. "Intent doesn't change the outcome, Grady. You're a good cop. But this is something else. You can't afford to make these kinds of mistakes." The captain turned away for a moment, running a hand through his hair, clearly thinking about the ramifications. When he turned back, his expression was resolute. "Here's what's going to happen," Martinez said, his voice calm but final. "I'm putting you on administrative leave, effective immediately. We'll conduct an internal review, and depending on the findings, we'll decide how to move forward. But make no mistake, this is serious, Grady. You're going to need to think long and hard about how you ended up in this situation." Tom felt a cold numbness spread through his body. Administrative leave. He had heard of officers being put on leave before, usually for something far worse than what he had done. But it was always the first step in a process that rarely ended well for the officer in question. He wanted to protest, to fight back, but he knew there was no use. The evidence was clear. The damage had been done. "Yes, sir," Tom muttered, barely able to meet Martinez's eyes. The captain nodded curtly. "Go home, Grady. We'll be in touch." Tom stood up, feeling the weight of every step as he made his way out of the office. The precinct was quieter now, but he could still feel the eyes on him as he walked toward the exit. Every officer in the room knew what had just happened. He was no longer Officer Tom Grady, the confident cop who had patrolled the streets for years. Now, he was the guy who had messed up badly, and no one would let him forget it. Outside, the cool evening air hit his face, but it did little to shake the heavy fog in his mind. His world, once so certain and solid, was now filled with doubt. He had spent years believing in the rightness of his instincts, his ability to read people and situations, but this time, his instincts had betrayed him, and it had cost him more than just a day's work. It might cost him his career, his reputation, and everything he had built. As he walked toward his car, Tom couldn't help but wonder if there was any coming back from this, a reckoning of conscience. Tom Grady sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the city as dusk began to fall. The precinct's lights glimmered faintly in his rearview mirror, but he couldn't bring himself to look back at it. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind replayed the events of the day in an endless loop. Administrative leave. The words echoed in his head like a death knell. He had worked so hard to build a reputation, to be the cop who could handle anything, who knew how to read a situation and act decisively. But today, everything had gone wrong. His instincts, those instincts he had always relied on, had led him astray, and now everything was falling apart. He hadn't planned on arresting Maya Williams. He hadn't planned on making a mistake that would put his entire career on the line. But now it was done, and there was no undoing it. Sitting alone in the quiet confines of his patrol car, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of guilt rising up in him, something he had been trying to suppress ever since the moment he placed those handcuffs on her wrists. There was no denying it anymore. He hadn't acted out of duty, or because Maya had done anything wrong. He had acted out of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of someone who didn't fit his expectations of what was normal for the neighborhood he patrolled. The truth of it stung, and Tom couldn't escape it now that he had a moment to reflect in silence. After sitting in the car for what felt like hours, Tom finally started the engine and drove away from the precinct. But he wasn't heading home. Home was where the weight of his decisions would only bear down on him further, where his family would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, Tom found himself driving through the city with no particular destination in mind. The streets were familiar to him, but tonight they felt foreign, as though he were seeing them through different eyes. The usual landmarks, the diner he frequented, the park where he'd made the arrest, seemed to blur as his mind drifted. His conscience gnawed at him with every turn. He finally pulled up to a small bar on the outskirts of town, a place he used to frequent in his earlier days on the force. It was the kind of spot where officers went to unwind, where the faces were familiar and no one asked too many questions. He needed a drink, something to quiet the noise in his head. Tom walked in, the dim lighting and low murmur of conversation offering a brief reprieve from the chaos in his mind. He made his way to the bar and ordered a whiskey, nodding to a couple of off-duty officers he recognized in the corner. They waved him over, but Tom shook his head. He wasn't in the mood for small talk or pretending that everything was fine. He took a long sip of the whiskey, feeling the burn as it slid down his throat. For a moment, it dulled the tension in his chest, but the relief was fleeting. As he sat there, staring into his glass, his thoughts returned to Maya. Her calmness, her composure, it had unnerved him. But now, looking back, he understood why. She wasn't just another citizen who had run afoul of the law. She was a woman who had seen through him, who had recognized the fear and prejudice that had driven his actions, even if he hadn't recognized it himself at the time. The more he thought about it, the more Tom realized that Maya wasn't just fighting for herself that day. She was standing for something bigger, for every black man and woman who had ever been unjustly accused, for every person who had been treated as suspicious simply because of the color of their skin. The weight of that realization made him feel small, insignificant. He had failed her, and he had failed himself. Just as Tom was about to order another drink, his phone buzzed on the bar counter. He glanced at it, half expecting it to be a message from the precinct or a call from Captain Martins. But instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Officer Grady," came the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, but not one he immediately recognized. "Yes, this is Grady," he replied, his brow furrowing. "This is Special Agent Maya Williams." Tom's heart skipped a beat. Of all the people he expected to hear from tonight, Maya was the last one. He could barely find his voice. "Agent Williams." She cut him off before he could say anything further. "I'm not calling to argue or to rehash what happened today, Officer Grady. I wanted to give you a chance to understand something." Tom swallowed hard, guilt and apprehension tightening in his chest. "I'm listening." There was a pause on the other end, and then Maya spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I could have pressed charges. I could have made this a bigger issue. But I didn't, because I believe that you're not beyond redemption. I think you made a mistake today, a big one, but I also think it's one you can learn from if you're willing to face it." Tom closed his eyes, her words hitting him harder than any reprimand from his captain. He had expected anger, maybe even contempt, but instead, Maya was offering him a path forward, one he wasn't sure he deserved. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see it at the time. But now, I see it. I see what I did." Maya's voice softened slightly. "Acknowledging it is the first step. But it's not enough. You have to understand why it happened, and you have to be willing to do something about it. This isn't just about one bad day, Officer Grady. It's about a system that allows this to happen over and over again." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. He had always seen himself as one of the good guys, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But today, he had been on the wrong side of justice, and Maya was right. This wasn't just about him. "What can I do?" he asked, the words escaping before he could fully process them. There was another pause on the line, and when Maya spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "You can start by educating yourself. Look into the history of policing in this country, the biases that are baked into the system. Talk to people who have experienced what I experienced today. And more importantly, listen. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be comfortable. But if you really want to change, that's where you begin." Tom nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I will. I promise." "I hope you do," Maya said quietly. "Because if you don't, the next person you arrest on a hunch might not be as lucky as I was." The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket of guilt and responsibility. He had made a mistake, and now it was up to him to decide what kind of man, what kind of officer, he wanted to be moving forward. "I'm sorry, Agent Williams," Tom said after a long silence, "for everything." There was a pause, and then Maya replied, "I accept your apology. But remember, Officer Grady, change doesn't happen with words. It happens with actions." With that, the line went dead, and Tom was left sitting at the bar, the empty glass of whiskey in front of him feeling heavier than ever. He stared down at it, the amber liquid reflecting the dim lights of the bar. He had a long road ahead of him, one filled with difficult conversations, soul-searching, and a reckoning with the part of himself he had always ignored. Tom Grady wasn't sure where this journey would lead him, but for the first time in a long while, he knew that it was one he had to take, not just for himself, but for everyone he had wronged, even if he didn't realize it at the time. As he stood up to leave, the bar's dim lighting casting long shadows on the floor, Tom knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. The path to redemption. The sun broke over the horizon the next morning, casting a soft light into the kitchen of Tom Grady's modest home. He sat at the table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him, and stared blankly at his phone. The conversation with Maya Williams from the previous night still weighed heavily on his mind, her words replaying over and over, each repetition adding more depth to the guilt and shame swirling within him. He had been up all night, unable to shake the feeling that everything he had believed about himself had been wrong. The idea of being a good cop, a protector of the community, now felt hollow. He wasn't sure when his instincts had shifted from vigilance to suspicion, but somewhere along the line, something had changed. His mind kept returning to the image of Maya, her calm but resolute gaze, the quiet strength she had shown in the face of his unwarranted arrest. And he realized, for the first time, that he had been part of the problem. He took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. It mirrored the taste of regret that lingered in his throat. His mind wandered to the precinct. In just a few days, news of his mistake would likely spread beyond the station walls, and soon enough, everyone in the city would know. Officer Tom Grady arrested an FBI agent on a hunch, they'd say. Racial profiling at its worst. And though the thought of public shame made him uneasy, it was the private reckoning that weighed the heaviest. After finishing his coffee, Tom stood up and walked to the window. His neighborhood was quiet, the houses neatly lined up along the street, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like part of this world. Everything felt different, as if the lens through which he had always viewed the world had been shattered. But there was no time to dwell in self-pity. Maya had made that clear. Change didn't happen through words. It happened through action. He had asked her what he could do, and she had laid it out plainly. He needed to educate himself, to confront the biases he had refused to acknowledge. And though the idea terrified him, Tom knew that the only way forward was through the uncomfortable truths that awaited him. Determined, he pulled out his laptop and sat back down at the table. He typed "History of Policing in America" into the search engine and began to read. At first, he wasn't sure where to start. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. But eventually, he found himself immersed in articles and books that detailed the long and troubling history of racial discrimination within law enforcement. He read about how policing in America had roots in slave patrols, about the systemic biases that had been passed down through generations, and about how even well-intentioned officers could perpetuate those biases without realizing it. Hours passed as he read, the sun climbing higher into the sky. With each article, each chapter, Tom felt his understanding deepen. He had always thought that racism was something overt, something obvious, burning crosses and slurs shouted in the streets. But now he was beginning to see that it was much more insidious than that. It was in the everyday assumptions, the subtle ways in which people of color were treated differently, the instinctive reactions that were born from years of conditioning rather than malice. As the day wore on, Tom's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Captain Martinez, asking him to come down to the precinct for a follow-up meeting. The internal investigation was proceeding quickly, and though the captain hadn't said much in the text, Tom could feel the gravity of the situation through the terse wording. Tom sighed heavily, closed his laptop, and grabbed his jacket. His heart raced as he thought about facing Martinez again. The captain had always been tough but fair. However, Tom knew that fairness would only get him so far in this situation. He had messed up, and there was no way to sugarcoat that. The drive to the precinct was quiet, the sound of his engine humming against the otherwise still morning. As he pulled into the lot and parked, his eyes lingered on the building. It was strange. He had spent years here, but today it felt foreign, almost as if he no longer belonged. The pit in his stomach grew as he entered the building, his steps heavy, each one echoing the uncertainty in his mind. Inside, the usual hustle and bustle of the station seemed subdued, as if the air itself had shifted since yesterday's events. He walked past a few officers who gave him brief nods of acknowledgement, but none of them engaged in their usual banter. Word had spread, and now he was a pariah. Tom took a deep breath as he knocked on the door to Captain Martinez's office. A muffled "come in" greeted him from the other side. Steeling himself, he entered the office and found the captain sitting behind his desk, papers strewn across it, his expression unreadable. "Grady," Martine said, motioning for him to sit down. Tom obeyed, sitting on the edge of the chair, his nerves on edge. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably before Martinez spoke again. "The investigation is underway," the captain began, his voice measured. "But you should know that this isn't just an internal matter anymore. Word's already starting to spread outside the precinct. There's a lot of heat coming down on us." Tom nodded, his throat tightening. "I understand, Captain, and I take full responsibility." Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying Tom for a moment. "That's good to hear, Grady. But understanding and responsibility are just the beginning. What I want to know is, what are you going to do next? Because this isn't going to end with a slap on the wrist. This is bigger than just you." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it laid out so plainly still stung. "I'm going to make things right," he said quietly. "I've been reading, learning about the history of, well, the history of how things got to be the way they are. I know I need to do more than just apologize. I need to change." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Change? What kind of change?" Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've started to realize that there's a lot I didn't understand about policing, about the way we interact with certain communities. I thought I was doing the right thing yesterday, but I wasn't. I made assumptions, and those assumptions led to a bad decision. I need to learn how to stop doing that. I need to understand the biases that I've ignored for too long." Martinez didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes boring into Tom's. Then he nodded slowly. "You're on the right track, Grady. But it's going to take more than reading a few articles to fix this. You've got to commit to this. This isn't just a phase you can pass through and come out the other side clean. You've got to do the work." Tom nodded. "I will, Captain. I promise." The captain studied him for another moment, then sighed. "For now, your administrative leave stands. The higher-ups are still deciding how to handle this, and we're going to be dealing with the fallout for a while. But I want you to keep working on this. Educate yourself, talk to people, and really listen. You've got a chance to turn this around, Grady, but it's not going to be easy." Tom stood, his resolve hardening. "Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down." Martinez gave him a curt nod, signaling the end of the conversation. As Tom left the office, he felt a mixture of relief and dread. There was still a long road ahead, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed large. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about salvaging his career anymore. It was about becoming the kind of person he had always thought he was but had failed to be. As Tom walked out of the precinct, the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the city. He didn't know where this journey would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to who he had been before. Transformation. Weeks had passed since Officer Tom Grady had been placed on administrative leave, and yet each day felt like a reckoning. His mornings were no longer filled with the familiar rhythm of putting on his uniform and heading to the precinct. Instead, he woke up to a silence that pressed heavily on him, a silence filled with self-reflection, discomfort, and questions he had long avoided asking himself. Sitting in the same chair at his kitchen table, Tom scrolled through yet another article on systemic racism in policing. The more he read, the more he realized how much he didn't know, how much he had never cared to learn. He had once thought that being a cop meant upholding justice, catching the bad guys, and protecting the community. But now, he understood that the very foundation of his beliefs was flawed, built on assumptions and biases that he had absorbed unconsciously over the years. Maya's words echoed in his mind constantly. Change doesn't happen with words. It happens with actions. He had started small, first by reading, and then by reaching out to people who had been on the other side of policing, those who had experienced the fear, the suspicion, and the unfair treatment that he had contributed to without even realizing it. He found online forums, watched documentaries, and even listened to the stories of former offenders who had been caught in the web of the justice system. Their stories opened his eyes to a side of law enforcement that he had never truly considered. It wasn't just about the individual officers or the criminals. It was about a system that disproportionately targeted certain communities: Black, Latino, poor, marginalized. And how, by blindly following his instincts, he had perpetuated that system without ever questioning it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom found himself driving through the same park where he had arrested Maya. The memory of that day still haunted him, the way he had felt so sure of himself, so righteous, as if he were protecting something by arresting her. Now, as he parked the car and stepped out, he realized how wrong he had been. The park, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, seemed peaceful, a far cry from the chaos that had unfolded here weeks ago. Tom walked to the bench where Maya had been sitting, remembering the way she had looked up at him with that calm, steady gaze. She had known something he hadn't, something deep and painful that he hadn't been ready to confront. Now, standing in that same spot, he understood. The next morning, Tom made a decision. He couldn't keep hiding behind articles and documentaries. It was time to take action, to do something that would make a real difference, not just for himself, but for the people he had wronged, directly and indirectly, during his years as an officer. He needed to speak to Maya. He needed to see her again, face to face, and tell her what he had come to understand. But reaching out to her wouldn't be easy. Tom had already tried calling her once, and though she had been gracious during their brief conversation, he knew it would take more than an apology to bridge the gap between them. He had to show her that he was serious, that he was committed to change. With determination, Tom searched for her office address at the FBI field office and wrote a letter, a handwritten one. He had drafted it multiple times, crumpling up each version when it didn't seem sincere enough. Finally, after hours of struggling with the right words, he finished. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Dear Special Agent Williams, I've thought about that day in the park every single day since it happened. I've thought about how wrong I was, how my assumptions led me to make a decision that not only humiliated you, but also reinforced a system that I now understand to be broken. I am deeply sorry, but I know that apologies are only words unless they are followed by action. Since then, I've been trying to educate myself, to understand the role that bias plays in policing, and how I have been part of a system that harms people like you far too often. I started reading, learning, and most importantly, listening to the voices that I once ignored. I know this doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't erase the hurt or the mistrust. But I want you to know that I am committed to changing, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been affected by the kind of policing that I represented on that day. I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, in person, if you are willing. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to learn, and I believe part of that learning is hearing from those who have been directly impacted by my actions. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Officer Tom Grady. Tom dropped the letter off at the FBI field office with a sense of unease. There was no telling if Maya would even read it, let alone respond. But he had to try. Days passed. Each one felt like a test of his patience and resolve. Tom continued to immerse himself in books, documentaries, and conversations, determined to do the work Maya had asked of him. He knew this wasn't about winning her forgiveness. It was about transforming himself into the kind of person who didn't need it. The person who could take responsibility for his past actions and actively work toward a future where those mistakes wouldn't be repeated. Then one afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, the phone rang. He glanced at the number and froze. It was Maya. With a deep breath, Tom answered. "Hello, Officer Grady." Maya's voice came through the line, steady and composed, just as he remembered it. "I received your letter." Tom felt his chest tighten. "Thank you for reading it," he said, his voice soft with gratitude. There was a brief pause on the other end. "I appreciate that you've been reflecting on what happened," Maya said. "I believe in second chances, Officer Grady, but I also believe that change is a long, hard road. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Tom exhaled, a weight lifting off his chest, even as the seriousness of her question settled in. "I am," he said with conviction. "I already started, but I know this is just the beginning." "Good," Maya replied, "because it's not just about you. It's about the people who trust you to protect them. It's about the communities that don't feel safe around officers like you because of experiences like mine." "I understand that now," Tom said, the words feeling truer than they ever had before. "And I want to do something about it." Maya was silent for a moment, and Tom wondered if he had said the right thing. Then she spoke again. "Meet me tomorrow," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "There's a community forum on policing and race happening at the local church. You'll hear firsthand from people who have had experiences like mine, and from those who haven't been as lucky. If you're serious about changing, you need to hear these stories." Tom felt a lump in his throat, the gravity of her invitation hitting him. This was the real test, the real challenge, facing the people he had failed, listening to their pain, and learning how to be better. "I'll be there," he said quietly. The next evening, Tom arrived at the church, his heart pounding in his chest. The building was packed, filled with people from all walks of life, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The forum had attracted both supporters of law enforcement and those who had been victims of its failings. Tom knew that walking into this room, wearing the uniform he had once been so proud of, was going to be difficult, but it was necessary. As the forum began, Tom listened intently as person after person shared their stories. Some were painful, filled with anger and grief. Others were hopeful, advocating for change and healing. Each story cut deep, exposing the raw wounds of a community that had been fractured by fear and distrust of the police. And with each story, Tom felt his resolve harden. Near the end of the evening, Maya stood up to speak. Tom watched as she walked to the front of the room, her posture strong, her presence commanding. When she spoke, her words echoed through the quiet hall. "We're here tonight to talk about change," Maya began. "Not just change in policy, but change in hearts and minds. It's not enough to reform the system if the people within that system don't change too. And that change starts with accountability. It starts with listening to the voices we've ignored for too long." Her eyes swept over the room, and for a brief moment, they landed on Tom. He felt the weight of her gaze, but this time, he didn't flinch. When the forum ended, Tom approached Maya, his heart racing. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she extended her hand. "Thank you for coming," Maya said, her voice sincere. Tom took her hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you for giving me the chance," he replied. As they stood there, surrounded by the voices of a community that had been hurt but not broken, Tom realized that this was just the beginning of his journey. But for the first time, he felt ready to walk the long road ahead, not as Officer Tom Grady, the man who had made mistakes, but as someone who was willing to do the work, to listen, and to change. To be continued. in the future that Tom Grady will create for himself and the community he swore to protect.